Competency 9. The ESL teacher understands factors that affect students' learning and implements strategies for creating an effective multicultural and multi-learning lingual learning environment. What does that really mean? These are the descriptors for this competency. Understanding cultural and linguistic diversity and how that works in the classroom. How to create an effective multicultural and multilingual learning environment. And here, the important part is addressing the effective linguistic and cognitive needs of ESL students. That is language that is in our law and maybe for sure on the test, I would think. And effective, we're going to talk about what that means in other domains, but effective is how comfortable they feel, stress-free, welcoming, that kind of thing. It's more of a social and emotional kind of aspect. Linguistic, obviously, is learning language, and the cognitive needs are their, academic and text and that kind of thing. So it's very important that we look at addressing all three of those things. And then knowing factors that contribute to cultural bias and how to create a culturally responsive learning environment. And there's lots of materials nowadays to explore more ways of doing this, information about implicit bias and things like that to really help, because we don't often recognize our own bias. Demonstrating sensitivity to students' diverse cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds and showing respect for language differences. This is important too, obviously, and it really helps that effective domain. When you do this, children feel valued and welcome. Applying strategies for creating among students an awareness and respect for linguistic and cultural diversity. So encouraging your class to also be that way with one another. Culture has many definitions. Here is one example. It's that complex whole, which includes the knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, customs, and other capabilities and habits that are acquired by man as a member of society. Cultural differences in communication styles and perceptions will lead to breakdowns, misunderstandings, and for children, difficulty in school. And we've all seen this before. Before I move on, let me say also that you can't assume that because children speak the same language that they have the same culture, because we have many students that speak a common language but really come from a different cultural background. And so that's a key point that you want to consider, okay? What are some individual variables that affect learning? Motivation, self-esteem, their attitude towards learning English, their degree of their first language proficiency, L1 is their native language, and how proficient are they already in their language. And this can also be different from different ages of students, okay? Their personality, are they introverted, extroverted, their social development, their general intelligence, communicative strategies, and, as I said, age. So we have to look at all these different factors when we're looking at all kids, not just English learners, but it's particularly critical when we think about, why is the student here? Why is the student, if they're an immigrant, why are they here? Are they excited about being here? Or was it a situation where they came under duress? Many times when I taught, I had high school students that thought if they misbehaved, maybe they could go home, that kind of thing. So you really have to get to know your students and what motivates them, how they feel about what their outside interests are, what exposure to the language, and so forth. Social variables affecting learning can also include their home, school, community, relatives, their peer groups, teachers, and all the school staff. So you may have students, especially older students, that have a job outside school, and maybe they use English in that job. Or you may have students that don't have exposure to the language at all. So these are some social variables that affect language development, but also can affect learning, the attitude towards of relatives and their peer groups towards education and so forth. So the important thing is to validate students' culture in the classroom, and there are many ways to do this. I suspect you already are doing many of these, but establishing a respectful, nourishing, and challenging classroom culture with high expectations for everyone. That's really important. It's easy to maybe feel sorry for the students, especially the immigrant students who have no English, and to not expect much from them because of that, because they need time, but we really don't have time. You know, the secondary students have things to do to be able to graduate, to move on, and so they have to work twice as hard, and we have to have really high expectations while also being empathetic toward them rather than sympathetic. The empathy will allow us to help them more and be understanding, but we still have to push them, just like all students. Recognizing differences among students that are due to culture. Sometimes there's things that happen in the classroom that are directly related to culture, and just recognizing that and helping students work through that. Valuing the strengths of each person, respecting their interests, abilities, languages, and dialects. And these are a lot of things that we already do with our students, but highly critical with these students because of those differences. And they may feel maybe self-conscious. Particularly when you have a small population of ELs, this can be very critical because they feel very shy and intimidated. Identifying their surface and deep culture elements. Okay, so by surface, these are things we see all the time and we think about, Cinco de Mayo and different kinds of food and things like that. And then the deep cultural elements may be things that we're not aware of. And so taking the time to learn about that. When I was teaching, there was a good book called Multicultural Manners. And of course, that's been a long time ago, so there's probably many more resources, even on the internet, to just learn a little bit about the various cultures. And that will be very helpful in your classroom. Generating ideas and getting these ideas from the students, from the parents. What would help to validate the culture? How can we learn more about your culture? And I think that really will not only provide some useful information, but also a community in the classroom. So what are some potential barriers? This is an activity that we do in the face-to-face course where you have partners talk and you give them scenarios. Like in some cultures, they don't look you in the eye, let's say. And so you have a card, like an index card, that tells that child to do that, or that adult, if you're teaching adults. And then the other student is, not from that culture, and they say, look me in the eye, or insist upon that. And how would that create a cultural situation? So that's just something to consider. Other things may be the type of language or how you talk to an individual. My own personal experience is my husband is Dutch, and they're very abrupt. And I don't mean rude, but they say what they mean, and they don't beat around the bush, so to speak. So there's just different things like that. And so in this activity, we create scenarios where the students can kind of play around with that. And that's something that you might do. There are different values from cultures, and values are difficult kind of because they are personal. Even within cultures, people have different values. But these are some generalized statements, and I want to really reiterate that these are things that are in general. They are not allowing for individual differences, okay? So in the U.S., we place very little emphasis on learning other languages as opposed to other cultures. And that's not necessarily true for everybody. Myself, I loved learning language. It was very important for me. But for the most part, it's not always required. In high school, it's not always required or even really encouraged or necessary. But in other cultures, most other cultures learn English in school so that they can use that, or they at least learn another language. So it's much more prominent. So the attitude towards learning language may be different. Some cultures are more verbal in their communication. Other cultures are more action-oriented. Don't talk about it, do it. There are differences in perspectives on time. When I say I'm going to be there at 10 o'clock, I'm there at 10 till probably. But other cultures are not as strict about that. It's more of a, we're going to have dinner at around 7. And maybe you go and dinner's at 9, but you socialize. It's just different type of patterns. Goals, long range versus short term. And these can be based on many things, not just culture, but on socioeconomic situations and so forth. Communicative approach, like I said about my husband, being very straightforward or abrupt, as opposed to kind of trying to be nice and ambiguous or avoid any kind of difficult topic. Focusing, the focus on the individual versus the group or the family, even more importantly. Some situations I've had teachers say to me, well, I don't know why that child doesn't come to school because it's very important for them to get an education. And while the student may believe that, if they need to go with the family and translate at the doctor or at somewhere else, they may do that at the expense of school because the family obligation is really more important to them. And then emotional versus intuitive, using your intellect as opposed to your emotional. Some of the elements of surface culture are visible, easily seen. They can change rapidly. They usually involve food or holidays or celebrations. And we see a lot of this in, historical or famous personalities. Whereas deep culture deals more with attitudes and beliefs. They change very slowly, if at all. They can include religious ceremony, marriage, maybe even music, dance, art, or ethics. And they can be more historical, social, humanitarian, and political in nature. Some examples of deep culture are here and have to do with a lot of things that we may or may not be aware of. One of the examples here on space and proxemics, that's how close you get to people. And so in the U.S., we typically have a fairly wide bubble around us that we don't want other people, strangers particularly, to get within that space. Whereas in other cultures, oftentimes where it's more crowded and people are used to being in each other's space, don't have that. An example of this is my daughter studied viola, and her teacher was from Eastern Europe. And she would say, "Mom, he gets in my space." But of course, learning the viola, sometimes you have to get in someone's face, or in their space, not face, sorry, to adjust their hand position or something like that. But she just said, they get very close to you when they're talking to you. And it was a little bit uncomfortable for her, even though she knew he meant nothing by it. The other kinds of things can be, how we relate to someone of the opposite sex. And what obligations and duties we have, what are some taboos and things. An example would be gestures. Sometimes we have a gesture here that we do quite commonly, but if we did it to someone from another culture, it would be offensive. And I'm thinking about the OK symbol or waving a person over with your hand straight up instead of facing down. There's some differences like that. Points to remember, really, about culture is that what seems logical or sensible or important to you or to a person in one culture doesn't necessarily make sense in another culture. So to say, well, that's just the way we do it, doesn't really take into account the other person's perspective or feelings. It's common for people that are in a culture that's not their native culture to feel apprehensive, maybe self-conscious, and maybe even lonely in that environment. And so we really have to be considerate and kind of reach out, especially with students, to make them feel welcome. And a lot of times with my students, I just explain that I may not understand this, but I would never offend you on purpose, you know, and I really want you to tell me if something I do is offensive or, you know, hurtful in any way, something like that. Because I think when people know you're aware and your intention is not that, they'll be more likely to share with you their feelings and feel more comfortable. A lot of times when we talk about culture, we always talk about the differences, and there are similarities, you know, among cultures. Every culture, you know, people love their babies. Every culture, you know, values communication. There's so many things that are really alike. It's just the nuances that may be different. And it requires experience and study to understand the subtleties of any culture, and that's a critical point. Here's some terminology that you might want to look at: acculturation, and that's when you really adjust to another culture, but maintain your own. And assimilation is when you are absorbed into the culture. So many of the people, you know, that are older nowadays may not still use their native language because they really assimilated and gave up their culture to become American. Now it's more common that students, you know, learn the language and become part of our culture, but still maintain their own cultural identity. Stereotyping is developing a fixed, unvaried idea about a cultural group, and that's one of the reasons I said in the beginning, you know, when I make a generalization about a culture, that's in a sense kind of what I'm doing, and that's why I wanted to include the caveat that, you know, there's always individual differences, and I'm just trying to talk in generalized. Okay. Prejudice, of course, you've heard of, is an adverse judgment or opinion formed without knowledge or examination of the facts, based just on a person's race or color, skin color, or culture. Ethnocentrism is believing in the superiority of your own ethnic group or an overriding concern with race. When students are acculturating or being acculturated, there are stages, you know, and you can be very excited at first and then be in culture shock, which can be anxiety and confusion. Then they say you have, you know, tentative recovery where you're, okay, I'm settling in. And then it's almost like a person makes a decision how much they're going to assimilate or adapt or integrate with that new culture. So it's a process. That's the main thing that students will go through, or any individual will go through. And just being aware of that is the important point of this slide. So here are your practice questions, number 13, 16, 25, and 35 in your prep manual. And be sure to answer the questions first and then read the rationale for the answers.